I don't think anyone tuning in will be unaware of the pressures the prison system has been under for a number of years, and I know you and your team of inspectors have flagged a number of key areas of concern, as well as, I'm pleased to say, a number of prisons that are bucking the trend. But perhaps we could start with the problem areas. You've highlighted that drugs is an increasing area of concern, even within the long-term high security estate. And you also noted a real concern about the growing influence of organised crime groups dealing drugs in prison. Can you say a bit more, please?
Yeah, certainly. And thanks very much, Russell. And it's great to be here, and it's great to see so many people joining in the call today. And we're really looking forward to hearing from you and your questions. I think drugs has obviously been an issue in prisons for a very long time, a big concern of this inspectorate. But I think drones are to some extent a new paradigm here, really, which is that organised crime gangs are able to get large quantities of contraband into prisons, often in very quick time. And it seems as if some of the methods of being able to do that are more and more sophisticated. They seem to be able to get stuff in, get the drone out very quickly. And they're also able to exploit any security weaknesses within the prison. So whether it's broken windows, whether it's a prison with very big grounds where there's lots of spaces to drop packages off. And of course, within the prison population, you have a large number of prisoners who are in prison because of their issues with drugs, very often because of what they've done while they're in a kind of drug-seeking mode. So whether it's things like crimes of violence, burglary. So you have, in effect, a captive market for organised crime gangs, and that is being exploited. And the challenge really here is first of all, about reducing the supply into prisons, so that particularly in the long-term high security state, it's making sure some of the basics are done, making sure that netting is in place, making sure that CCTV is fixed. It's also about making sure staff are really well trained, so they know the sorts of things to look out for. They're making sure that proper checks are being done around about the prison, that they're responding to intelligence reports and making sure that they're being dealt with well. But then the second half of it is about reducing demand. And that's about getting prisoners out of their cells into proper purposeful activity. I mean, if you're locked behind your door for 22 hours a day, as sadly many prisoners are, and you have nothing else to do, you can understand the temptation for certainly some men and women just to take drugs just in order to pass the time. So making sure there's proper purposeful activity in place, but also making sure that there are proper rehabilitation activities. And we talk about some jails where there's some really good stuff going on, but also other prisons where they have a drug-free wing, but the drug-free wing really isn't doing the stuff that it needs to. So reduce the supply, and then work on reducing the demand. And that's the way in which we can make progress here.
Thanks, Charlie. You and your team have also been particularly worried about the increase in violence and the response to that by prison staff, which has included a real rise in the use of segregation and more instances of pepper spray. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, indeed. Where you get drugs in prison, and some of the violence is certainly fueled by the drug problems. Where you get violence in prison, you get debt, and where you get debt, that debt is either paid off by family members, very often on the outside, or it's paid off by or it's paid off with violence, very sadly. But also there are more prisoners under the influence that makes them more volatile. So drugs and violence certainly are linked together, and of course. And therefore staff have to intervene during a violent incident. And very often we see some really impressive work where really well-trained staff are intervening very carefully and sensibly. But we do also see use of interventions that are not appropriate. For example, with things like the use of parva, which is supposed to be used in extreme circumstances, but certainly we've come across occasions where it's very hard to justify the use that we've seen. And it appears to be a pattern that it becomes a habit in some prisons more than others. So we know that staff sometimes have to intervene. They do it often at great courage and great risk to themselves, but nevertheless, they have to do it in the right way. And that's important that they are properly trained in order to use the minimum amount of force in order to manage what can be a difficult and volatile situation.
Thanks, Charlie. Along with drugs and violence, unfortunately, and I suppose predictably, real concerns about the number of self-inflicted deaths, the levels of self-harm.
Yes, indeed. Particularly in the women's estate, where we know that levels of self-harm are something like 8 times higher than they are in the male estate. There is some good news actually on some of the things we've seen recently in women's prisons, where we put out a very powerful thematic report last year called Time to Care. And that was about levels of self-harm, about the cycle that many women of self-harm and often mental health difficulties that they're trapped in while they're in prison. And we've actually seen a reduction in the use of restraint in order to stop people from self-harming. So prison officers being able to respond with from a wider palette of initiatives. And also a reduction in the use of anti-ligature clothing, which used to be almost a default in some jails when self-harm was going on. So some encouraging things there, but nevertheless, levels of self-harm too high. What's causing self-harm? Well, we know that lots of prisons already have got very fragile mental health, if not a diagnosable condition. We know that where prisoners are frightened, they're more likely to self-harm. Where they're locked up in their cells with very little to do during the day, that's also a cause of self-harm. Or if they're being intimidated or they have drug debt, again, they can sometimes resort to self-harm. And sadly, we continue to see too many suicides in prison. And we've come across some jails which have had some really worrying patterns. I think in recent years, HMP Leeds has had something like 16 suicides. Having said that, at our recent review, actually, we were impressed with what they were beginning to do to try and improve that situation. But particularly concerning in the reception prisons, very busy, complex population, people coming in straight off the streets, sometimes detoxing from drugs and alcohol, sometimes very heavy offence-related anxiety, relationships with family, often very restrained depending on the offence. So some big challenges there. And there are jails that do this well, but there are also jails that we continue to be worried about.
Thank you, Charlie. I know a key fundamental concern, and I saw that you led with this actually in your press release, is the amount of time that people are spending in their cells, missing out on education, missing out on training, and obviously with really serious long-term impact on their mental health.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is it is one of the fundamental things that this inspectorate has reported on really since our founding in 1982. I think the very first report that came out talked about blank inactivity and the boredom of prisoners just sitting, existing rather than spending their time in a meaningful way. It's always been the lowest of our 4 healthy prison assessments, purposeful activity. But since the pandemic, things have got worse. They just simply haven't recovered to the level that they should be at. And what does that mean? It means that the public who have a reasonable expectation that prisoners, when they come out, will be less likely to reoffend when they came in. But sadly, if prisoners are locked in their cells for very long periods of time, if they're not getting access to purposeful activity, but they are getting access to things like drugs, it then becomes any idea that rehabilitation will be taking place is simply fanciful. On top of that, we've seen cuts to education provision, sometimes very severe. I think it was North Sea Camp where they've had over 60% cut in their provision, which again compounds what is already a very difficult situation. So one of the things I would like to see as a result of the reduction recently in the current prison population is to take the opportunity to reorientate towards really thinking about how prisoners spend their time. And are they doing it in a meaningful way, which is going to make them less likely to reoffend when they come out? I mean, it costs 57 grand to lock someone up. Let's try and get better value for money for that so that we don't create another generation of criminals for people coming out.
Thank you, Charlie. Another key issue, and I think it really comes through in the report that you're really frustrated with the physical state of a lot of our prisons and, well, the apparent inability of the prison service in lots of cases just to get basic refurbishment done.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great, I talk to governors inevitably all the time, and this is a great source of frustration for them, whereby they're waiting for procurement processes, long protracted MOJ procurement process in order to commission building work, and they often feel they're stuck in a kind of pecking order, waiting for money to be released to be available. So we know there's an issue with having enough money, but there's also an issue with the way in which money gets spent. And we've seen some really pretty egregious examples. Liverpool Prison has had wings being refurbished now for many, many years. Birmingham, we inspected in 2019 before my time, had an excoriating report of that particular establishment. As a result, they decanted prisoners from two wings, which they were going to refurbish. Those wings still haven't reopened. There's a crane which sits above Birmingham Prison almost as a monument to the enormous delays because it hadn't been used for years. It was just sitting there, but it was more expensive to remove the crane and put it back again after one of the contractors went bust. So what it means is you've got both in these big infrastructure projects, but also just on some really basic stuff. We inspected HMP Featherstone the other day, for example. We went back for a review. I mean, this is a 1973 built prison. It has flat roofs. It has all the problems with some of the architecture of that era. You've got the prison frantically repairing flooring, but of course, what they're not able to do is repair the roofing that is the cause of the flooring coming up. They couldn't get men into activities on one of the days we were there because there was a very big thunderstorm and the air vents had been locked open and they couldn't unlock them and close them in time to stop the rain getting in. So these kind of infrastructure problems, it doesn't just make day-to-day living more irksome for prisoners, it actually genuinely affects the way in which the prison is able to run.
Thank you, Charlie. Before we turn to the next question, can I just remind anyone on the call who'd like to ask a question? We're going to have lots of time for questions. Please just submit that via the Q&A section on the top of your screen. Turning to women's prisons now, Charlie, a much more mixed picture. I've noticed lots of really positive examples of great work by staff, but also concerns about self-harm, mental health, and preparation for kind of release and good support there.
Yeah. I mean, look, we know that the women's population is a different sort of population, and therefore the skills for prison officers, the way in which those prisons are run needs to be different. And I think there has been some encouraging work in trying to some extent, disaggregate what goes on in male prisons from what goes in female prisons. And I think the credit must go to the prison group director for women's prisons, Carleen Dixon, who I think has worked really hard to fight her corner for, what is it, 3,800, about 8% of the prison population, which is women, in order to make sure, for example, that staff get proper training in place, that they are understanding or being able to look beyond the behaviour that they're often confronted by, and be able to understand ways in which women can be helped. But nevertheless, some of those kind of ongoing frustrations continue. So still too much time locked behind their doors for many women. Again, that purposeful activity isn't the kind of stuff that's really going to help them when they get out. Drug treatment, not always as good as we would like to see. And then finally, that critical thing of coming back into the community, that they really need looking after, they really need support when they come back. And very often it feels like there's a mismatch between what happens in prisons and what happens in the community. There are some great organisations who are helping through the Dick Gate and trying to do that, but at times it feels very fragile, particularly with the accommodation issues that we know are a real problem for women leaving custody.
Thank you, Charlie. One of the rare, criminal justice success stories over the last 20 years has been the huge reduction in the number of children in custody. However, you point out in that section in the report that most YOIs and other secure training centres are not succeeding at all in coping with the complex needs of this much smaller group of children who are now in custody.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I've been in this world since 2015, when I did my review of the youth justice system. The report was published in 2016. So it is, I have to say, a great source of frustration for me that we are still saying very similar things to what I discovered when I initially did that report, more than 10 years ago now. And that is that there is really a gap between the capability of some of the YOIs and the need level of the children who are in there. And sadly, that gap is very often being filled with violence, with incredibly complicated keep apart lists, which means that lots of children are unable to mix with each other, which means that they can't be unlocked at the same time, which means the regime in children's prisons continues to be a source of real concern. So, you're lucky if you're getting out for more than 6 hours a day in many establishments, and sometimes it's as little as 4 hours. 4 hours a day means 20 hours locked behind your door. And these are for predominantly fit young men who really need to be involved in proper purposeful activity. Young men who have often had an incredibly disjointed life up until then, whose education is almost inevitably incomplete as a result of that. And yet they're not getting into classes. They're allocated to classrooms, to lessons, not because of what they're interested in or because of where their aptitude lies, but very often they're put into rooms with people simply because they won't fight with them. So it feels like there's a very long way to go still with the youth secure estate, that some of the issues that I was raising back in 2015 continue to be a problem. Um, a very top heavy management teams very often, but not enough staff on the ground actually being able to do that work. And this is in the context of some really inspiring, really impressive, even in a really hard to run jail like Feltham, you go there and you can't help but be inspired by the dedication of some of the staff who work there. But it's almost as if the lack of training, the lack of really high quality behavior management means that we're ending up with kids locked up for so long that their frustration grows. They're shouting at each other between cells. That winds everybody up. And the danger then is if they do meet each other, they end up having a fight. So we're feeding the worst sort of grandiosity of these kids. What we want them to do is feel safe, secure, looked after, cared for, and making progress academically, socially, and with their offending. And instead, what we're seeing is a lot of their behaviour being compounded by being within prisons. It is just worth again giving a shout out to HMP Park in South Wales, which does continue to buck the trend. So recent inspection of there, we gave it a 4 in each of our healthy prison assessments, so good in each of our healthy prisons. There is a really big gap between the achievements of HMP Park and the other 3 young offender institutes, and also the Secure Training Centre. So look, we know this can be done, and that is such a source of frustration for me and the team who inspect in this area.
Thank you, Charlie. I was hoping you would mention Park because as someone that reads the inspection reports, I know for years there's been a culture of excellence there that just hasn't kind of spread elsewhere.
That's right.
I think perhaps not everyone on the call will know that you're also responsible for immigration removal centres. And I know you've actually been really pleased by some substantial improvements made by a couple of those centres this year.
Yeah, we have. It's been encouraging. We put out some very worrying inspections in the last couple of years, particularly at Harmondsworth. But recently, we saw some really encouraging progress there under an excellent director, Sarah Mallender, who'd really galvanised their staff, worked really well, got the Home Office pulling in the right direction. So that was really encouraging to see. But also in places like Dungavel up in Scotland, Derwentide in County Durham, we've seen some really well-run establishments which are doing a much better job with a complex and often transient population. So I think we are kind of cautiously encouraged by what we're seeing in the immigration estate, which is often a very challenging environment in which to work and also to live. But we are seeing basic standards maintained in a way that perhaps we don't always see in prisons.
Thanks, Charlie. It's a theme that I know you emphasised throughout the report, but doesn't often make it into the headlines, that you routinely meet lots and lots of examples of very committed and hardworking staff. And I know many inspection reports highlight areas of best practice. And also, actually, my favourite report of the last year was the report you did on how a number of prisons have succeeded in promoting reading all across the establishment. So I wonder if you talk about some of those positives, please.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, anybody who's been following the inspectorate for the last 6 years will know that as an ex-head teacher of a special school, that reading is incredibly important to me, that the value of reading and the possibility for prisoners to make progress with reading often unlocks all kinds of other opportunities for them elsewhere in life. We also know that illiteracy rates in prison, or functional illiteracy rates in prison are probably around 50 to 60%. So there is a huge amount of need out there. And we'd done our report with Ofsted in 2022, where we were pretty depressed about what we found, that particularly the neediest prisoners were getting the least amount of support. So this time round, we went and looked at some places where across the whole spectrum. So we looked at women's prisons, we looked at Category A prisons up at Franklin. We went to Chelmsford as a complex Victorian reception prison. We went to Cat C prisons such as Ranby, and a sex offender prison at Rye Hill. And what we wanted to highlight was the really impressive practice that we saw there in all of those jails, irrespective of the circumstances in which, very difficult circumstances in which staff and the prison was operating, with the challenges of drugs and drones and population pressures and churn. But nevertheless, we were able to see a really strong reading culture being inculcated into those jails, that those very needy prisons were getting support, but also the really strong readers were being inspired by really impressive libraries, by librarians who were doing more than just lending out books. They were really engaging with prisoners, and also that they were working with staff to understand that actually, and wing staff, prison officers, that actually, if prisoners learn to read, actually there are lots of benefits, not only while they're in jail, but also elsewhere. So I remember at Ranby, they put out a checklist for prison officers just to say, if someone always orders from the same menu, if someone finds it very hard to understand what's going on during the day, if someone's very reluctant to read anything and will often make a fuss if they're asked to do that, that it's something to do with reading, and therefore make a referral and see if we can do some work there. So even in a challenging jail like Ranby, which has got lots of issues with drugs, it's got a very big perimeter there in Nottinghamshire, it was really encouraging to see that where there's real commitment from leadership, we see progress being made. You go to a jail like Hatfield, open prison just outside Doncaster, and it's just terrific what you see there. The whole prison is just suffused with reading. You walk around with the governor there, Mick Mills, and he accosts random prisoners as they're walking about and asks them what book they're reading. And you really feel that it is absolutely part of what goes on in that jail. So it can be done, and we really want jails to pick that up and do it elsewhere.
Excellent. Thanks, Charlie. Finally, because I'm really keen that we honour our promise that people get to ask their own questions, this annual report, which I know is the last of your 6 years in charge as Chief Inspector, shares lots of the concerns of its predecessors. The government last week announced that an independent prison review to be led by Amber Rudd is going to take place and report before Christmas. What are your hopes for that review will achieve?
Well, I think there's a window at the moment, Russell. I think there are some encouraging things that we're seeing recently. So the last quarter's safety stats showed a reduction in violence in assaults on prisoners, between prisoners, and a reduction in assaults on staff. That's really encouraging. We've also seen the population drop. We were down to our last kind of couple of hundred spaces in the whole country at one stage. I mean, it looked like the system was going to fall over, but now we have around 3,000 spaces. And after the early release schemes begin in September, it looks like even more space will be available. That does create a real opportunity. So I think the Amber Rudd review, I hope, will be able to exploit the opportunity whereby, for a change, prisons aren't in the level of crisis that they have been. In my time as Chief Inspector, we had COVID, which blew prisons up for a long period of time. Then we've had this population explosion, which again has put prisons under enormous strain. There is going to be a window for a bit where, fingers crossed, there isn't a crisis going on, where there is a little bit of breathing space for people to think more strategically about how they can focus in on purposeful activity, keeping prisoners safe, making sure that rehabilitation is taking place, making sure there's proper drug activity, and that prisoners are really adequately prepared to be able to take their place back in the community when they come out. So I think there are some grounds for optimism. We look forward to engaging with Amber Rudd and her review team, and we'll watch this space to see whether what currently there are some encouraging signs, whether that turns into a trend in the future.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Well, I'm pleased to say lots of people have put questions, so let's not hang about and crack on to them. Tom Wheatley, as you know from the Prison Governors Association, asks, has HMPPS got an impossible task? Essentially, do they have sufficient money to deal with the 86,000 or so people in prison at the moment?
I think they have a very difficult task, and Tom rightly raises this and does brilliant work in the Prison Governors Association, flagging these issues regularly. He knows far better than I ever will the frustrations of prison governors when it comes to being able to get work done in their prisons, the difficulties with procurement exercises, the frustrations governors have with the way in which things like recruitment gets done. So look, I think it is difficult, and it's always going to be to some extent difficult in prisons, because there is never going to be a Secretary of State, or there's never going to be a Prime Minister who's going to stand up in the Commons and say, in order to improve the standards in our prison, we're going to remove money from the National Health Service or from from our schools. That's not going to happen. So the challenge is always, can we make the best out of the resources that we've got? And I suppose my grounds for optimism, and they're writ clear in this report, is that we do go to jails who, despite the challenges that they face, are able to do well. So you go to a prison like Lincoln, and actually they're really being able to, and this is a busy reception jail, they're able to do some good stuff there. Similarly, our report on Doncaster, again, some really encouraging things going on at that jail, a safe and relatively decent establishment. You go into the open estate, and I think they're probably some of the best prisons in the world that we have within our open estate. Some of the Category C prisons that are really trying to get prisoners into education, training, and work, and make progress. So I think there's enough out there to say that more and better is possible, and that I think we could have a system about which we could be more proud. But nevertheless, we also know there are strong headwinds for prison. There will always be strong headwinds. But I think, as I said, this window that we have where the population pressures have been reduced, I think that does give us an opportunity to be able to do a little bit more here, to think a bit more strategically about what prisons are for, and the way in which we support governors to be able to run great establishments.
Thanks, Charlie. It's great that there's the potential for hope, at least.
There are too many good people out there that we meet on inspection every week, even in prisons that are in difficulty. There are too many great people out there to become pessimistic.
Thanks, Charlie. Next question. Carl Melia from the MOJ asks about the increasing number of older people in our prisons, which I know you flag in a number of different reports. Says, from your perspective, where do you think the priority areas, where are the biggest gaps that the service needs to address for those people?
I think this is a really big challenge, and it's growing. You can see the average age of prisoners has been creeping up over the years, and particularly if you go to sex offender prisons, often you've got some very elderly men there who have got very high levels of need. So you go to a jail like the Verne down in Dorset, and parts of the jail just feel like a care home. Similarly, we were at HMP Bure a couple of weeks ago, and some very elderly men are there. Isle of Wight, again, very elderly men in conditions that are just not really appropriate for them. But also in terms of resource, these prisoners take up a huge amount of resource because They, of course, have developing health issues inevitably, so they're having to go out to hospital. That means that you need staff to escort them to do that. That means potentially that has a negative effect on the regime elsewhere. So I think there is a challenge for the prison service to think about actually what is the best way to care for this growing group of elderly prisoners. How do we make sure that facilities are really adequate in order to be able to look after them properly and that they're able to thrive while they're in prisons? And also for these very elderly men, those suffering from men and women, those suffering potentially from dementia, or how do we make sure that they get the right level of support or end of life care as they get older and older? So, this is not an issue that's going away anytime fast. And I think when we're looking at the allocation of resources, I think this needs to be taken into account.
Thanks, Charlie. Our next question comes from Andy Keane-Stam from PACT, who, as you know, as I'm sure most people on the call know, are the biggest provider of services to the families of people in prison. He says that they really welcome the recent publication of your thematic on family and relationships, and understands that future inspections will focus more on that issue. He says, beyond the practical business of actually making sure that visits happen, what can governors expect this to look like? What are you going to focus on? What are you hoping to see?
Well, I mean, a shout out to Andy and to his organisation, PACT, who do great stuff in so many of the prisons that we visit. Brilliant, dedicated staff team who really help to support that process and make it effective. I think one of the things we want to see is that, look, it's great having organisations like PACT working in prison. That makes a real difference. But what we see in the best prisons is there's a real buy-in to the idea and the importance of families and visits, not only in order to keep prisoners happy, but also the rehabilitative importance of families, but also the importance for families themselves, particularly children, to be able to maintain that contact with their father or mother while they are locked up. So we want to see the sort of transformative family arrangements that we see in many jails. We'd like to see that, or in some of the jails we visit, we'd like to see that more widely. We'd like to see that real understanding of the importance of families, not just as a sort of rudimentary function that the prison has to perform, but really at the heart of something that is so important to prisoners, that really makes a difference in terms of their sense of safety, security, their happiness, their behaviour, which can really be helped by making sure that family engagement is really positive. But also for people visiting prisons, to make sure that experience, it's always going to be weird going into a prison, we know that, but making sure that experience is at least as decent and productive as possible, that people feel positive enough about it that they'll want to come back and they'll want to be able to maintain that relationship. We know at the moment that many prisoners are being held a long way from home, and of course that's a key factor too, because it's a real struggle for families to be able to afford to get there on visits. The number of visits has actually gone down, and HMPPS needs to look at what the reason for that is. Now, the hypothesis may be that that's partly because of in-cell telephony, which is a big improvement on certainly in previous years. But nevertheless, there is something about that face-to-face contact that you can't replicate down a telephone line or over an email. So what we hope is that from our inspections is that the work of the very best prisons gets replicated elsewhere, in order that families are really seen as the heart, those relationships are seen as at the heart of one of the most important aspects of prison work.
Thanks, Charlie. I think there's no doubt that for many men, women and children in custody, their visits, their contact with their loved ones is their number one priority.
Without doubt, without doubt.
The next question is a topic that's close to my heart. Esther asks, what role could there be or should there be for more restorative justice approaches in prisons?
I think there are possibilities for this. I think restorative justice is one of those things that instinctively feels right, and we know the evidence is strong on it. But my only caveat with restorative justice is this, that it has to be done really well. It has to be done in the right way, because where restorative justice goes wrong, it can actually be re-traumatizing for the victims of crime. And funnily enough, I used to work in a anti-bullying charity. I used to do some work when I was in education. And one of the issues that cropped up quite often was where restorative justice attempts by school staff who hadn't been properly trained had actually been the cause of more distress. But the evidence is clear that restorative justice, in the right cases, with the right people, where the agreements and the groundworks are done really well, can make a big difference. It's resource intensive, but it can also be transformative. People might have seen the play Punch that was. I saw it up in Nottingham, but it also transferred to the West End, about a very moving restorative justice process and the way in which that works. So, yes, there is a place for restorative justice, and it can make a difference, but it has to be done by really effective, well-trained staff.
Thanks, Charlie. We've got a couple of questions now. I'm going to give you two in one around purposeful activity and literacy reading. One from Jane Rigby, who asks around, given the importance of basic literacy, as you've said, just to access everything, all the positive rehabilitation opportunities, what more should prisoners and service providers, excuse me, be doing to ensure people with those barriers around reading aren't excluded from the interventions that are designed to reduce reoffending? And with that question, Charlie, one from Rachel Treweek, Bishop of Gloucester, and as you know, the Bishop for Prisons, who really kind of lobbies hard for a better prison estate. How do we push, she asks, for a strong legislative definition for the purpose of prison? And what's your dream regarding really joining up prison and probation and that through the gate experience, so that people that are coming out have got the best chance of turning their lives around?
Well, two questions from extremely distinguished people. Jane is chief exec at the Shannon Trust and does terrific work there, and that is an organisation that supports the mentoring of individual prisoners by their fellows, and supports the process of reading. It is so critical. It has such a transformative effect on the lives of prisoners, where learning to read can change the way they feel about themselves, can change the way that they interact with the world around them, because suddenly what was previously unintelligible and frightening symbols suddenly becomes a world of meaning into which they can engage. So from a utilitarian point of view, having people who read means they do better in prison, and they can succeed more when they come out because they can get work. But also on a more profound level, that actually we know the importance of reading and the way in which that can have a transformative effect on people's empathy, on the way they see the world, on their understanding of themselves and other people around them. So it is absolutely critical, and that commitment from prisons is critical, but also with the support of great organisations such as the Shannon Trust. We're enormously lucky to have Bishop Rachel, who is an astonishing advocate for making improvements within prisons and focusing in on doing the right thing when it comes to supporting prisoners. I think it's really interesting what the bishop is talking about in terms of actually what is custody for, because I still think there's a debate that goes on here about to what extent is it about punishment, is it about public protection, is it about rehabilitation, or is it about deterrence? And it's incredibly unclear, really. And if you talk to people in prisons, you talk to people, to members of the public as well, everybody's got a different view of that. And I think finding a way to really establish a clear vision for what our expectations are for people when they go into prison, what we expect that prison should be for, I think will help to focus in the resources of prisons into making sure that they are achieving what we want them to achieve. So we're very lucky to have people like Jane Rigby, people like Bishop Rachel, continuing to push really hard in these two critical areas. But I think only when we're really clear about why we lock people up can we be really clear about what we expect them to do when they are locked up. And then the way in which they can then link with services on the outside, not just probation services and statutory services, but also with the many brilliant third sector organisations that are out there that will help prisoners to come out and to resettle well. I was recently at a residential drug rehabilitation centre just down off Ladbroke Grove, and one of the things that they talked about there was that they offered a brilliant support for people whose lives have been completely blighted, and the people around them's lives have been blighted by their addiction to drugs and their drug-seeking behaviour, and it was having a transformative effect. But what they were saying was that sometimes they didn't always get referrals from prisons at the right time, early enough, and with enough, or focusing in on the right people. So it does sometimes feel that these services are disjointed, that we talk about a criminal justice system, but sometimes it feels like there are cogs spinning freely and they're not interlocking with each other. So I think a vision for what we lock people up for what we mean when we talk about a criminal justice system, will help to make sure that the different parts of the system, both statutory and third sector, are working together to share a common aim.
Thank you, Charlie. You're earning your corn today. I'm bowling you another double header now. Prison visitors and the role of the third sector. So Elizabeth McKee, apologies if I pronounced your last name wrong there, who's chair of the National Association of Prison Visitors, she says, should the inspectorate have the provision of official visitors at prisons as one of their goals? And she quotes a PSI, a prison service instruction. And then the second part of this one comes from the new CEO of CLINCS, the voluntary sector organisation for criminal justice, Summer Elson-Smith, who says she'd be interested to know how you see the role of the voluntary sector evolving in prisons and through the gate going forward, especially given the financial restrictions. We know from CLINC's annual State of the Sector reports that a number of third sector organisations are effectively subsidising their government contracts by raising funds, elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think prison visitors do a terrific job. We often flag up the great work they do. I remember thinking of HMP The Verne, where quite a large, it's in a fairly remote part of Dorset, right out there on Portland, and a lot of prisoners, it's a sex offender jail, a lot of them weren't getting visitors at all. There was one just amazing prison visitor who would come week after week and sit down with prisoners who didn't get visits, listen to them, talk to them, and just try and introduce a little bit of normality in their lives. So we often comment very favourably on the work of prison visitors, on that sort of freedom that they have, in a way that they're not constrained by they're not constrained by a more specific role that we as inspectors are, or the people who work in prisons are, that they're able to talk in a freer way and across a broader spectrum of ways with prisoners. So prison visitors played a central role, and we take our hat off to them, and we have enormous respect for the work that they do. And I think that leads me on to Summer's question, which again is about the third sector and about the importance of the third sector. We're incredibly blessed in this country to have so many brilliant third sector organisations, such a real sense of dedication and understanding that actually with the right level of support, a far greater proportion of prisoners can get rehabilitation, can get support. I do think it's about having that relationship on a really even and good footing. Too much third sector involvement, I think, is dependent on one really good person in the prison, whether it's the governor or someone else commissioning that work. And I know that Summer and her team at CLINCS do a really good job in terms of being able to lobby more widely to recognise the work of the third sector. But we see lots of really good work, but sometimes it's a source of frustration that actually that can't be spread more widely, that some of that great stuff that's working well in one jail isn't working elsewhere. Now, sometimes that's to do because charities are hyper local, and often some of the best are very small organisations which are doing brilliant work, just in one or a couple of jails. But there is great work out there, but it just feels a bit precarious at times. And I think more investment in terms of not just money, but in terms of real engagement from not just individual prisons, but the prison service, I think would help in this area.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Caroline Vine raises an issue that has always been close to the inspectorate's heart, I think. Really asking about mental health, and particularly people with serious mental health problems who are stuck waiting for a very long time to be moved to secure units. And she notes that some community secure units are closing, which obviously will exacerbate the problem.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a long source of concern for us at the inspectorate. It goes way before my time. You only have to walk around a prison and you don't have to be clinically trained to be able to spot the huge amount of mental health or mental health distress that so many prisoners are going through. And some of it is with really serious diagnosable conditions. And some of it is people who just have generally poor mental health, compounded by other lifestyle issues, and also by the fact that they're locked in prison, often for long periods of time, without enough to do during the day. So, and there are also challenges within prisons of having the right type of mental health support. Sometimes we find that there are really good services for people who are in crisis, but some of those, but there aren't necessarily the opportunities for people who are unwell and at risk in the future of going into crisis. Now that feels like a huge miss, because actually the more that prisons are able to do to stop people from falling over the edge into a full-on mental health crisis, the better. But sadly, we're still continuing to see, and we were in HMP Birmingham a couple of weeks ago, we're still continue to see some incredibly unwell people coming into prisons, acutely psychotic, who just, by any will in the world, just shouldn't be in prison. They're putting a huge strain on the prison system. They're enormously at risk themselves and potentially putting the people around them at risk, and particularly the very dedicated staff who try and look after them. But they're not mental health trained. These are not prisoners who can be detained under the Mental Health Act and are often refusing to take their medication, and so are not being treated. And we came across a case, I think it was more than 700 days in HMP Swaleside, where a prisoner had been waiting for a transfer to hospital. In Birmingham, 6 or 7 prisoners a month were coming into the jail who hadn't been adequately assessed at the police station and were coming in with incredibly high levels of need. I think it's a real scandal that we are locking up people who shouldn't be in prison, who should be in hospital. And we wouldn't do that with people with a broken leg. And we shouldn't do that with the broken people that we often see as we go around on inspection.
Thank you, Charlie. We're into the last 10 minutes of the webinar now, so we're beginning to turn to kind of look ahead to what the future might hold, and also to give you the chance to reflect on your 6 years as Chief Inspector. Jasmine Silver asks, to what extent do you think the government's response to the overcrowding crisis will end up improving outcomes related to self-harm, access to purposeful activity, and the actual physical environment of our prisons?
Well, let's wait and see. But I have some hopes that this is an opportunity that if the prison service ministers, MOJ, if they really grasp this opportunity, there is a chance to have some transformative effects within the prison system. We know loads of challenges remain. We've talked about infrastructure. We've talked about staffing challenges. But actually, at least turning the dial on that acute pressure that we've seen prisons across the board being under recently will make a difference. Of course, the future isn't without its challenges as well, because we know, for example, prisoners coming back on 56-day fixed-term recalls. We wait to see where those prisoners are going to end up. Are they going to stay in reception prisons? Are they going to be shipped into Cat C prisons? What is a reasonable expectation of what the offer should be and the expectation should be for those prisoners, so that they don't come back into the jail again. So we try and get away from this revolving door that sadly we see too many times, where prisoners go out, they breach their release conditions, and they're back in jail again within a matter of days. So and also making sure that as Bishop Rachel said about that the interface between the through the gate interface between what's happening in prisons and what's going on in the community, and that process works well. So look, we'll wait and see. I think it's going to be a difficult few months for prisoners. It's going to be a real challenge out there for probation services as well. But if the goal is ultimately that we have more spaces within our prisons, that will be a positive thing. And it's something that prison governors will be able to take advantage of if they're given the freedom to be able to do it.
Thank you, Charlie. John Collins of the Prisoners Education Trust asks, he says, he knows that leadership has become a real priority for you at the Inspectorate, and really kind of tying in with what you were saying to Tom Wheatley's first question. Do you think enough is being done to support governors and improve the quality of leadership in our prisons?
Well, I mean, just first of all, just to mention the great work that John does at the Trust, and you know, a really brilliant and inspiring organisation. Look, I'm a huge admirer of prison governors. I think they are the most dedicated and impressive public servants that I've come across in my career. They're travelling huge distances. They carry enormous risk. They do it incredibly good-naturedly very often. You know, a population of 1,200 men and 600 staff. It really is astonishing what they take on. But it's a really difficult job, and they must have the right levels of support in order to be able to do that well. The prison service doesn't train people. You know, you get promotions in most jobs, and you get training that goes with the promotion. Within the prison service, you get promoted from Band 3 prison officer up to SO, up to custody manager, up to a functional lead, up into deputy governor to governor. In other jobs, there will be training at each one of those promotions. In the prison service, there isn't. Now, there's a new initiative, the Enable Project, which has been developed within the prison service, and we'll see the impact of that. And with luck, that will help to plug some of those gaps there. But governors don't get enough training. And the other thing I would just add with governors, you know, one of the reasons why in the last few years, probably the private sector prisons have been outperforming public sector prisons, and they do have some innate advantages. Often they're in better buildings. So I'm not making a direct comparison here, but I would say this, that they are better at putting responsibility and accountability in the same place. So governors in the private sector have a bigger budget they're able to use, and they're trusted to be able to use it in a way that they think is appropriate for their establishment. They're very much held to account for their performance, but they're given the trust in order to be able to do the job. And sometimes I think within our public sector prisons, sometimes it feels like that doesn't always happen, where governors are not able to make decisions on what I think are some really critical issues, you know, in terms of being able to buy stuff, in terms of being able to employ staff, in terms of being able to decide the way in which the prison will operate. And I think you can mandate mediocrity, but you have to unleash talent. You have to give people the freedom to be able to really grow and to succeed and to do brilliant things. And I think sometimes the nervousness about letting go of the reins in the centre, and you can understand where that comes from, but the nervousness in the centre about letting go of the reins, I think constrains outstanding governors from really being able to flourish in a way that would transform our prisons.
Thank you, Charlie. Last couple of questions now, and you'll be glad to know you've got about 3 minutes to answer these. So one from your Scottish colleague, Sarah Snell, who says, it can be really frustrating not only to review, recommend, repeat in your work as an inspector, but sometimes actually to find things getting worse. She says, as you come to the end of your 6 years, Charlie, what do you think are the big achievements you think the Inspectorate has been part of delivering? And going with that, Matt Bullard says, again, as you come to the end, he says, what key messages for the future would you give to two groups of people, those working in prisons and those who are working at head office?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I've been incredibly lucky to have this job. I've got the most brilliant team, a level of dedication that is just staggering, a focus in on the mission, which has made this just a brilliant job to do. Prisons are endlessly fascinating places, and and I'm full of admiration for the people who work in them and for the job that they do. It will be with some sadness that I leave, because I've made some great friends out there in the system and some people who I just think are really brilliant. I think in terms of the achievements, if nothing else, and this is really critical, I think the Inspectorate of Prisons stopped stuff from getting worse. I think we are able to hold up a mirror to the system and just say that is not good enough. That is not okay, and we can't carry on like that. And I think that does make a difference. But also, I think I can point to, and I think the team will be able to point to, many prisons where we've been to that have been in a real state, where we've gone back to them, and with the right governor in there, but given the freedoms to do the job well, we can see how things can be transformed. HMP Bristol, 2 urgent notifications, really good progress on a review. Similarly, at HMP Exeter, Bedford, a really tough jail to run. We went back there for a review, some good things going on. We re-inspected Loudon Grange, probably one of the tougher jails in the country. And again, some progress there. Even in Wandsworth, where Andy Davey has done a terrific job, sadly leaving at the end of the year. Even at Wandsworth, which was really falling apart when we inspected it, what was it, 2.5 years ago? Really encouraging to see that, it's by no means perfect, and Wandsworth probably never will be with the population that it's got, with so many men in such a constrained space. But nevertheless, being able to pull a jail like that back from the brink and begin to get it going in the right direction again. So I'm leaving with some optimism. I'm sad to be going. I'm sad to be leaving the team that I've enjoyed working with so much. But I think this is an incredibly important role. Being able to hold up a mirror to institutions into which the public can't always look. And it's been a great privilege to do the job, and I will certainly miss it. But I'll leave it, with much pride in the organisation. And I hope that whoever takes over from me in the future will appreciate the great organisation and will be able to take it on to new and different directions.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Thanks very much for your work. Thanks for answering all those questions so straightforwardly. Thanks to the more or less 150 people who have been on the call. I'll just remind you that the report, the recording from this, and all the resources are on the Prison Inspectorate's website. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Russell. Thanks, everyone.